Chapter 20, Henry 1509, by Charles Oman. Henry Tudor had the good fortune to appear upon the scene as the avenger of all wrongs, those of the injured heirs of York, no less than those of the long-exiled partisans of Lancaster. His victory had been won by the aid of Yorkists like Stanley, Dorset, and Edward Woodville, no less than by that of Oxford, Pembroke, the Courtenays, the Talbots, and other old Lancastrian names. It had been settled, long before he started, that he should blend the claims of the two rival houses by marrying the Princess Elizabeth, the eldest child of Edward IV. Thus he was able to pose as the reconciler of parties, and the bringer-in of peace and quiet. He proved his moderation by abstaining from bloodshed. He spared all the prisoners of Bosworth save 3 alone, and though he caused a bill of attainder to be passed against King Richard's chief partisans, no more executions followed. Henry's wise view of the situation was set forth by a law which he caused one of his parliaments to approve at a subsequent date, to the effect that no man should ever be accused of treason for supporting the king de facto against the king de jure. It required all Henry's moderation and ability, however, to make firm his seat upon the throne. His title to it was very weak, only that of conquest in fact, for the legitimacy of the Beaufort line as representatives of John of Gaunt was more than doubtful. Henry refused to rest his claim to the crown merely on his marriage to Elizabeth of York. He would be no mere king consort, and he deliberately put off the wedding until he had been crowned at PG 273 Westminster and had been saluted by Parliament as king in his own right. Having thus made his position clear, he married Elizabeth 6 months after the day of Bosworth Field. Henry Tudor was precisely the sovereign that England required to put an end to the general unrest and unruliness that were the legacy of the Wars of the Roses. He had not an amiable character. He was reserved and suspicious, a master of plot and intrigue, selfish in act and thought, prone to hoard money in and out of season, and ready to strike unmercifully when a stroke seemed necessary. But his brain ruled his passions, and from policy, if not from natural inclination, he was clement and slow to anger. He had some turn for art and letters, and was religious in his own self-centered way. His ministers were wisely chosen. The 2 chief of them, Bishops Morton and Fox, were prudent and blameless men. If Empson and Dudley, his 2 financial advisers, were much hated by the people for their extortions, it was because their master bade them fill his coffers, and was content that they should bear the unpopularity which must otherwise have fallen on himself. He deliberately chose to have scapegoats, lest he should have to take the responsibility for the harsher side of his policy. The earlier years of Henry's reign were much disturbed by petty rebellions, the last groundswell of discontent and lawlessness, which lingered on after the great tempest of the Wars of the Roses had abated. Richard III had left behind him a few devoted partisans who had resolved never to submit. The chief were John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who had been declared heir to the throne by the late king, and Lord Lovell, the sole survivor of the 3 favorites who had ruled all England under the Hog. They were bold, reckless men, ready to risk all for ambition and revenge. Before Henry had been a year on the throne, Lovell secretly collected a band of desperate friends and tried to kidnap him while he was visiting York. Foiled in this scheme, Lovell fled to Flanders, where he was sheltered by Margaret, Duchess of Burgundy, the widowed sister of King Edward IV. With her and with Lincoln, he concerted a second plan of rebellion. They resolved to try to rouse the wrecks of the Yorkist party in the name of Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of Clarence, who PG 274 had been put to death in 1478, and the only male heir of the House of York. This prince was in King Henry's hands, safely kept in custody in the Tower of London. Till they could liberate him, they resolved to make an impostor assume his name and title. So they instructed a clever boy named Lambert Simnel, the son of an organ-maker at Oxford, to act the part of the young Clarence, reasoning that Henry would not dare to put the real prince to death, but would keep him alive in order to make the imposture clear, and so they could free the real Clarence if they succeeded, and dismiss the false one when he was no longer needed. Ireland had always been friendly to the House of York, and there was no one there who knew the young prince or could detect his counterfeit. So Lambert Simnel was first sent thither to try the temper of the Irish, giving out that he had just escaped from the Tower. The Earl of Kildare and other prominent Anglo-Irish barons were wholly cozened by the young impostor, and saluted him as king. 4,000 men under Lord Thomas Fitzgerald were raised to aid him. Lincoln and Lovell joined him with 2,000 veteran German mercenaries under a captain named Martin Schwartz. They crossed to England and landed in Lancashire, where a few desperate Yorkists joined them. Then advancing inland, they met King Henry at Stoke, near Newark. But their ill-compacted army was routed, the Germans and Irish were cut to pieces, and Lincoln, Schwartz, and Fitzgerald all slain. Lovell escaped to his manor of Minster Lovell, in Oxfordshire, and lurked in a secret chamber, where he was starved to death in hiding. Lambert Simnel fell into the hands of the king, who treated him with contempt instead of slaying him. He lived many years after as a cook in the royal kitchen. The rebels in Ireland were pardoned on submission, for Henry was loth to stir up further troubles in that distressful country, 1488. Thinking perhaps to turn the attention of the nation from domestic troubles by the old expedient of a war with France, the king in the next year joined in a struggle which was raging in Brittany. Charles VIII, the son of Louis XI, was trying to annex the duchy, whose heiress was a young girl, the Duchess Anne. Henry agreed to aid this ancient ally of England, and sent over troops PG 275 both to Brittany and to Calais. The war went not unprosperously at first, and the garrison of Calais won a considerable victory at Dixmude in Flanders. But after a time, the Bretons grew weary of the struggle, and the Duchess Anne surrendered herself to King Charles, and became his wife, 1491. Thus the last of the great French feudal states was united to the crown. For the future the English could get no support from them, and as a consequence, all English invasions of France in the ensuing age met with little good fortune. There was never again any chance of dismembering a divided France, such as that with which Edward III and Henry VIII had to deal. The king recognized his powerlessness and gladly made peace with Charles VIII. On receiving a subsidy of 745,000 crowns, a better bargain than Edward IV had made under similar circumstances at Picquigny, 1492. Henry was wise to make an early and profitable peace, for new troubles were brewing for him at home. News came from Ireland that a young man was secretly harbored at Cork, who gave himself out to be Richard of York, the younger of the two princes smothered in the Tower 9 years before. When Henry ordered his arrest, he fled to Flanders and took refuge with Duchess Margaret, who at once recognized him as her true nephew and gave him a royal reception and a safe refuge for 2 years. There is no doubt, however, that he was really Perkin Warbeck, the son of a citizen of Tournai, who had plunged very young into a life of adventure, and hoped to gain something by fishing in the troubled waters of English politics. By Margaret's help Perkin engaged in secret intrigues with the few Yorkists who yet survived in England. But King Henry traced out all his plots, and beheaded Lord Fitzwalter and Sir William Stanley, who had listened to his tempting. Stanley's case was a bad one. He had betrayed Richard III at Bosworth, like his brother Lord Stanley, and had been lavishly rewarded by Henry VII, yet would not keep faithful to his new master because he was refused an earldom, 1495. Though his friends had been detected, the pretender persisted in venturing an attack on England. With 2,000 men raised with money lent him by Duchess Margaret, he tried to land in Kent, but the Kentish men rose and drove him off. He then sailed to PG 276 Ireland, where like his predecessor Lambert Simnel, he met with some support. But hearing that James IV of Scotland was on the brink of war with the English, he soon passed over to the Scottish court, where he was received with royal state. James IV married him to his cousin, Lady Catherine Gordon, and placed him at the head of an expedition with which he was to try and raise rebellion in Yorkshire, where the supporters of the House of York were still supposed to be numerous. But when Perkin crossed the border, not an Englishman would join him, and he was obliged to return ignominiously to Scotland. From thence the restless adventurer soon set out on a new quest. The heavy taxation, which King Henry raised from his subjects, to pay for an army to resist the Scots had provoked much murmuring in some parts of England. Most of all had it been resented in the remote shire of Cornwall, where the local discontent took the form of armed gatherings to resist the taxes. Flammock, a lawyer, and Michael Joseph, a farrier of Bodmin, two turbulent demagogues, put themselves at the head of the rioters, and persuaded them to march on London, there to expostulate with the king. Lord Audley, an unwise South Country baron, joined their company, and led them as far as Blackheath, close to the gates of London. From thence they sent the king messages, bidding him to dismiss his extortionate ministers and remove his taxes. Henry was taken by surprise, as he had just sent off his army against the Scots, but he promptly recalled the expedition and gave battle to the Cornishmen. The fight of Blackheath ended in their complete discomfiture. Audley, Flammock, and Joseph were taken and executed, but the king let the rest go away unharmed, as mere deluded tools of their leaders. June 1497. Warbeck had heard of the rising of the Cornishmen, and thought that he discerned in it his best opportunity of making head against King Henry. He landed at Whitesand Bay, but found that he was too late, as the insurgents had already been defeated and scattered. But he rallied around him the wrecks of their bands, and made an attack on Exeter. Being foiled by the stout resistance of the citizens, and hearing that the king was coming against him with a great host, the pretender suddenly lost heart, left his men in the PG 277 Lurch, and fled away to take sanctuary in the Abbey of Beaulieu. August 1497. King Henry showed extraordinary moderation in dealing with the insurgents. He fined Cornwall heavily but ordered no executions. He promised Warbeck his life if he would leave his sanctuary, and when the impostor gave himself up, he was merely placed in honorable custody in the Tower. He was only made to publish the confession of his fraud, and to give a full account of his real life and adventures. Perkin might have lived to old age, like Lambert Simnel, if he had been content to keep quiet. But he made 2 attempts to escape from England, which roused the king's wrath. On the second occasion he persuaded another state prisoner, Edward of Clarence, the true heir of York, to fly with him, but they were detected, and the king, provoked at last, executed Warbeck, and made the unfortunate Prince Edward share his fate. 1499. Perkin had merited his end, but it is impossible to pardon Henry's dealings with the unlucky heir of Clarence, who had been a prisoner ever since Richard III sent him to the Tower 16 years before. There is no doubt that Henry was glad of the excuse to lop off another branch from the stem of York. Noting this fact, the next heir of that line, Edmund de la Pole, brother of the Earl of Lincoln who fell at Stoke, wisely fled from England, lest his royal blood should be his ruin. After Warbeck's failure, King Henry was for the future free from the danger of dynastic risings against the House of Tudor. He was able to develop his policy, both at home and abroad, without any further danger of insurrections. In domestic matters, he strove very successfully to put an end to the turbulence which had been left behind from the times of the Civil War. His chief weapon was legislation against livery and maintenance, the evil custom by which a great lord gave his badge to his neighbors, and undertook to support them in their quarrels and lawsuits. This abuse of local influence was sternly suppressed, and no man, however great, was permitted to keep about him more than a limited number of liveried retainers. It is on record that Henry punished his oldest friend and supporter, the Earl of Oxford, for breaking this rule. On the occasion of a royal visit to his castle PG 278 of Hedingham, Oxford received the king at the head of many hundreds of his followers, all clad in the De Vere livery, and was promptly made to pay a heavy fine for his ostentation. Henry established a special tribunal for dealing with the offenses of men, whose power and influence might foil and divert the ordinary course of justice. This was the new and unconstitutional Court of Star Chamber, a committee of trusted members of the Privy Council, which met in a room at Westminster, whose roof was decorated with a pattern of stars. The court was useful at the time, but grew to be a serious grievance in later days, because it stood over and above the ordinary law of the land, and was used to carry out any illegal punishment that the king might devise. By these arbitrary means, Henry Tudor succeeded in taming the survivors of the baronage, and in reducing them to such a state of subjection to the crown as England had never before seen. Their spirit had already been broken by the endless slaughters and confiscations of the Wars of the Roses, and the majority of them were well content to surrender the anarchical independence which they had enjoyed of late, in return for a quiet and undisturbed security for life and land. It is to be noticed that many of the oldest and most powerful houses had now disappeared. By the year 1500, there only survived of the older and greater peerages those of Northumberland, Westmoreland, Arundel, Buckingham, Devon, and Oxford, to which may be added the Duchy of Norfolk, afterwards restored to the Howards by Henry VIII. If we find other ancient titles borne by men of the Tudor time, we must remember that the holders were not the heirs of the lines whose names they bore, and did not possess the vast estates that had made those titles all-important. The Warwicks or Somersets, the Suffolks or Herefords of the 16th century are the mere creatures of Tudor caprice. A few words are necessary to explain the tiresome and difficult subject of the foreign policy of Henry VII. We have seen that his venture of war with France in 1491 proved unfortunate, and he never repeated it. For the future, he preferred to hoard money at home, rather than to lavish it on continental wars. But if he never fought again, he was always threatening to fight, winning what advantage he PG 279 could by the menace of joining one or other of the parties which then divided Europe. The main troubles of continental politics in his period were caused by the restless ambition of the kings of France. Freed from the lingering wars with England which had previously been their bane, the French monarchs had turned southward and were striving to conquer Italy. Charles VIII and Louis XII, the two contemporaries of King Henry, spent all their energy in the attempt to annex the Kingdom of Naples and the Duchy of Milan, to which they had some shadowy claim of succession. Their schemes called into the field the sovereigns whose position would have been imperiled by the French conquest of Italy: the Emperor, Maximilian of Austria, and Ferdinand and Isabella, the sovereigns of Aragon and Castile, whose marriage had created the United Kingdom of Spain. If the struggle had raged in Italy alone, Henry VII might have viewed it with a philosophically indifference. But it also involved the Netherlands, the near neighbor of England, and the chief market for English trade. The Netherlands were at this moment in the hands of Philip of Austria, the son of the emperor, for Maximilian had married Mary of Burgundy, the heiress of the great dukes who had ruled in the Low Countries, and Philip was their only son. Henry wished to keep on good terms with his neighbors in Flanders, more especially because it was there that the Yorkist refugees found shelter. Not only had the Dowager Duchess Margaret aided them from thence, but Maximilian, while acting as regent in the Netherlands for his young son Philip, had given Perkin Warbeck much assistance. Henry's policy was rendered difficult by the incurable perverseness of the emperor and his son, the Duke Philip, but he managed to keep out of war with them, and even obtained from them the Great Intercourse, a commercial treaty with the Low Countries which was of much use to England, as it provided for the free entry of English goods into Flanders, and of Flemish goods into England, and stipulated that the king and the duke should join together to put down piracy in the narrow seas. Some years later Henry was enabled to wring some further advantages out of Duke Philip, in a not very honorable way. The duke was PG 280 sailing to Spain, when his ship was driven into Weymouth by a storm. The king made him welcome and entertained him royally, but would not suffer him to depart till he had promised to surrender the Yorkist refugee, Edmund de la Pole, who was then staying in Flanders, and to still further extend the terms of the Great Intercourse to the benefit of English merchants. 1506. With Ferdinand of Aragon, the astute and unscrupulous King of Spain, Henry was able to get on better terms than with his capricious neighbor in Flanders, since both were guided purely by self-interest. The two wily kings understood and respected each other, and resolved to ally themselves by a marriage. Accordingly, Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's eldest son, was wedded to Catherine, the younger daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. They were both mere children, and the prince died before he had reached the age of 17. But Ferdinand resolved that the alliance should not drop through, and the Princess Catherine was passed on to Henry, Arthur's younger brother and successor in the title of Prince of Wales. He was some years younger than his bride, and the marriage, as we shall presently see, was a most unhappy one. With his son's wife, the English king received a large but unpunctually paid dowry. King Henry's long diplomatic intrigues with Spain and the emperor brought him no very great profit in the end, but it was otherwise with his dealings with his neighbors in the British Isles. After the defeat of Perkin Warbeck, he made an advantageous peace with James IV of Scotland, who married his daughter Margaret, and became his firm ally. For the last 10 years of his reign, Scotland gave no trouble. The still more difficult task of pacifying Ireland was also carried out with considerable success. Henry dealt very gently with the Irish chiefs, in spite of the treasonable support that they had given both to Simnel and to Warbeck. His plan of ruling the country was to enlist in his favour the Earl of Kildare, the most powerful of the Irish barons, by making him Lord Deputy, and entrusting him with very full control over the rest. All Ireland cannot rule the Earl of PG 281 Kildare, it had been said, but the king answered, "Then the Earl of Kildare shall rule all Ireland." This policy was attended by a fair measure of success. If turbulent himself, the Earl at least put down all other riotous chiefs. Henry's reign was also notable in Ireland for the passing of Poyning's Act at the Parliament of Drogheda. This put the Irish legislature in strict subordination to England, by providing that all laws brought before it must previously receive the assent of the king and his English Privy Council, 1495. Henry Tudor died before his time in 1509, having not yet reached the age of 54. He left behind him a land peaceful and orderly, a nobility tamed and reduced to obedience, and a treasury filled with £1,800,000 in hard cash, the best possible witness to his wisdom and ability, for no king of England had ever built up such a hoard before. If his aims had been selfish and his hand hard, he had at any rate given England strong governance, and saved her from sinking into anarchy.